My name is Carter, I'm 30 years old, and for the last 5 years, I've been completely absent from my family's life, not because I moved far away or lost contact by accident, but because one day I realized that staying meant accepting a version of myself they had already decided on, and I refused to live the rest of my life inside that box. And the moment that pushed me to that decision didn't come from some dramatic explosion. It came from something small, almost insignificant on the surface. A family dinner where I was once again reminded exactly where I stood in their eyes. I remember sitting there after a long day of juggling 2 jobs, exhausted and barely present, while my older brother Brandon held court at the table, talking about his latest success like it was the most natural thing in the world, and everyone listened, nodded, praised him, the golden son who could do no wrong, while I sat quietly, unnoticed until I was needed, and then my mother leaned toward me and said, almost casually, "Can you clear the table? The grown-ups are talking." And the words landed heavier than they should have, not because of what they meant in isolation, but because of everything behind them. Years of being overlooked, compared, minimized, and in that moment it all came into focus. I was 25 years old, I had a degree, I was working harder than anyone in that room just to stay afloat, yet somehow I was still the child in their eyes, still the one who served instead of being heard, and I remember looking around, waiting for someone to object, to laugh it off, to say something that would acknowledge how ridiculous it sounded, but no one did. Brandon didn't even look up, just smirked faintly like it was expected, like this was exactly where I belonged, and that was the moment something inside me went quiet. Not anger, not sadness, just a cold clarity that I had been trying to ignore for years. That no matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, I would always be cast in the same role because it was easier for them to keep me there. And that night, when I got back to my tiny apartment, I sat in the dark for a long time thinking about my life, about where it was headed, and whether I was willing to keep fighting for validation from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. And the answer, when it finally came, was simple. I wasn't. So I stopped showing up. I didn't make a scene, didn't announce anything, I just disappeared, stopped attending gatherings, stopped answering calls, stopped being available. And at first I thought someone would notice, that there would be questions, concern, maybe even an attempt to understand why I had pulled away. But none of that came. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the silence from them was louder than anything they had ever said to me. Because it confirmed what I had always suspected, that my presence had never really mattered, and those first months on my own were brutal. There's no other way to describe it. I was broke, overworked, and constantly battling the urge to go back, to apologize for things that weren't even my fault, just so I wouldn't feel so alone. I worked whatever jobs I could find, cleaning offices, doing night shifts, anything that paid enough to keep a roof over my head. And in whatever time I had left, I taught myself skills that felt completely out of reach at the time. Coding, systems, anything that could eventually give me a way out of the cycle I was stuck in, and most nights, it felt pointless. Like I was throwing effort into a void that would never give anything back. But every once in a while there would be a small win. A piece of code that worked, a freelance task completed, a payment that came from something I had built instead of something I endured. And those moments, small as they were, kept me going. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. I started to understand what I was doing. Started to see opportunities where, before there had only been struggle, and over time, the life I had been barely holding together began to take shape into something more stable. Something that was actually mine. And I remember the exact moment I realized I had crossed a point of no return. It was late at night. I was alone in my apartment, staring at my laptop as an email came through, confirming a licensing deal for a system I had spent years building in silence. Something I had once worked on out of desperation now being recognized as valuable. And I just sat there staring at the screen. Not celebrating, not reacting, just absorbing the reality that I had done it, that I had built something real without anyone's help, without anyone even believing in me, and in that moment I understood that I no longer needed anything from them, not approval, not recognition, nothing. But at the same time, a question lingered in the back of my mind, not about whether I could go back, but about what would happen if I did. If I walked into that world again not as the person they dismissed, but as someone they couldn't ignore, and that question stayed with me, quietly, until 5 years later. When an invitation arrived that would force me to finally find out. A simple wedding invitation from my cousin Grace. Something that should have been easy to ignore, but, because it meant stepping back into a past I had worked so hard to leave behind. And as I held that card in my hands, I knew one thing for certain: if I went, nothing about that night would be simple. The invitation sat on my desk for 3 days before I finally decided to go. Not because I felt any obligation to my family, but because something in me needed to see them again. Needed to test whether the distance I had built over 5 years was real, or just something that would collapse the moment I stepped back into their world. And when the day of the wedding arrived, everything felt strangely familiar, and completely foreign at the same time. The venue was exactly the kind of place my family loved. Expensive, polished, designed to impress. And as I walked in, dressed simply but sharply, I could feel the weight of recognition spreading slowly through the room. People noticing me in fragments. whispers starting before anyone had the courage to approach directly, and for a while I just observed, watching the same dynamics play out as if nothing had changed. Brandon at the center of it all, confident, loud, still playing the role of the successful son who carried the family name forward. My parents orbiting around him, proud and comfortable in the narrative they had built. And for a brief moment, I wondered if coming back had been a mistake. But then Brandon noticed me, and the look on his face shifted from confusion to amusement as he made his way over, drink in hand, that same familiar smirk forming before he even spoke. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said, glancing me up and down like he was trying to place me back into the version of me he remembered. "I thought you were off somewhere learning how to scrub toilets professionally." And a few people nearby laughed, not loudly, but enough to remind me how easy it had always been for him to set the tone, and for a second, the old instinct to shrink, to deflect, to disappear tried to surface, but it didn't land the same way anymore, because this time I wasn't the same person standing in front of him. So instead of reacting, I just smiled slightly, calm, almost indifferent, and said nothing, which seemed to irritate him more than any comeback could have. And then, almost casually, I reached into my pocket and pressed the key fob in my hand, and across the lawn, just beyond the glass panels of the reception hall, a sleek car lit up and chirped, drawing a few curious glances from nearby guests. The kind of reaction you couldn't manufacture, and Brandon's expression flickered for just a second, not quite confusion, not quite concern, but something in between, and I met his eyes and said quietly, "Turns out I learned a few other things too," before stepping past him and leaving him standing there without the last word, which, for him, was probably the most unfamiliar position of all, and as the evening continued, the atmosphere around me shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. People who had once ignored me now approached with polite curiosity, asking vague questions, trying to piece together where I had been and what I had been doing, and I answered just enough to satisfy them without giving anything away, because I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there to observe, to understand, and to finally see the truth of what I had left behind. And for a while things remained controlled, almost civil, until the speeches began. And that's when everything started to tilt, because Brandon, of course, couldn't resist the microphone. He took it with the same confidence he had always carried, making a show of congratulating Grace and her partner, saying all the right things at first. Charming, practiced, exactly what everyone expected, but then, as the speech went on, his tone shifted slightly, just enough to redirect attention, just enough to pull the spotlight back toward himself, and eventually, inevitably, toward me. "And it's great to see family come together, like this," he said, pausing just long enough to let the room settle. "Even the ones who wander off chasing dreams." A few scattered chuckles followed, and, he continued, "I guess some people spend their time building real lives, and others spend it, I don't know, painting ideas that never quite become anything." The words were wrapped in humor, but the intent was clear, and I could feel the room watching, waiting for a reaction, the same dynamic playing out again, just like it always had. But this time something was different, not in what he said, but in how little it affected me. Because the truth was, his version of me no longer existed, and his words were aimed at someone who wasn't there anymore. So instead of reacting, I simply took a slow sip of my drink, calm, unaffected, which seemed to unsettle him far more than anger ever could have. And after the speech ended, the tension didn't disappear, it just shifted, became quieter, more focused, and later that night, as the reception thinned out, and conversations became more private, Brandon found me again, this time without an audience, his tone no longer playful but edged with something sharper, more deliberate. "You really think showing up like this changes anything?" he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "Because it doesn't. You know that, right?" Didn't respond immediately, just watched him, letting him fill the silence, the way he always did, and then he added, almost casually, "Mom and Dad already made their decision anyway. You're not part of the plan anymore. Inheritance, assets, all of it. You're basically an extra piece that never fit." And there it was, the real message beneath everything else. Not just dismissal but erasure. And for a brief moment, I felt something crack beneath the surface, not the old kind of hurt but something colder, more focused, like a line had been crossed that couldn't be ignored. And instead of reacting emotionally, I felt something else take over. Something calculated, precise. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the past 5 years, it was how to step back, analyze and act with intention. And as I looked at him standing there so confident in the narrative he had built, so certain of his control over everything, I realized that this wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. This was about something deeper, something structural. And if he was so sure of his position, so comfortable making those claims, then it meant there was something behind it, something worth examining. And in that moment, the night stopped being about reunion or closure and became something else entirely. Something strategic. Because I wasn't going to argue with him, and I wasn't going to try to prove myself with words. I had spent too many years doing that already. Instead, I simply nodded once, as if accepting what he said, and replied quietly, "We'll see," before walking away, leaving him with the assumption that he had won, that nothing had changed, when in reality, That conversation had just set something in motion that he couldn't yet see. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to the story he was telling. I was preparing to uncover the one he was hiding. Brandon's words at the wedding didn't hurt in the way they once would have. They ignited something sharper, a quiet strategic fire that had been smoldering for years. Because over the next few weeks, I set out to uncover exactly what kind of control he had built behind the scenes. Hiring a private corporate investigator named Vernon, who specialized in financial discrepancies, shell companies, and subtle manipulations. And what we found was staggering. Brandon hadn't just been enjoying a reputation as the responsible, golden son. He had quietly transferred the family lake house into a shell corporation under his name, funneled maintenance funds into fake invoices paid to his friends, and even begun moving liquid assets into tax-sheltered accounts that would completely exclude me. Every family-first story he told was a carefully constructed lie, and each new piece of evidence added to a blueprint of deceit so intricate it could have taken decades to unravel if left unchecked. But now, armed with proof, I no longer felt the old resentment or the urge to confront him. With shouting or anger, I felt control, because knowledge is leverage, and the kind that can't be ignored. So I waited for the right moment, and that moment arrived at my father's retirement party at the lake house, the very property Brandon now technically owned, where he stood at the podium giving a speech about legacy, oblivious to the storm about to hit him. And I stepped forward calmly, plugging a USB drive into the media system, watching the screen flicker to life. As images of deeds, invoices, and incriminating emails filled the display, and the room went silent, a collective gasp, rippling as people realized that everything Brandon had presented as careful stewardship was actually a series of self-serving moves. And I looked at my father and asked plainly, "Did you know the lake house no longer belongs to you?" Brandon's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing without forming words, trying to claim it was standard planning. But the silence of the room swallowed him, and when my mother finally asked the same question, he hesitated, and then, impossibly, she slapped him. A sharp crack of truth that resonated across the room as she whispered, "You weren't protecting us. You were protecting yourself." And just like that, his allies melted away. The carefully constructed kingdom he had built in shadows cracked, leaving him exposed and powerless. And 3 days later, my father called me for coffee, admitting that he had been wrong to believe Brandon because it had been easier to trust the image he presented than to see the truth. And in that conversation, he handed me a letter, naming me co-executive of the family trust, effectively removing Brandon from positions of power. And when the audits began, his shell companies unraveled quickly, leaving him with money but none of the respect he had counted on, the one currency that mattered most in the family. And for the first time in years, I was no longer the invisible, dismissed puzzle piece, no longer the background character in someone else's story. I was the one finishing the picture, and as I stood there watching everything realign, I felt a quiet certainty that this time, I wasn't leaving. Because the life I had built in absence wasn't just proof of my independence. It was the foundation that finally allowed me to be fully, undeniably present, and nothing anyone else said or did could ever erase that again.